The room is still, as if time itself had stopped to listen. Dust drifts lazily through a single shaft of sunlight, painting golden lines across an old mahogany desk. The air smells faintly of cedar and paper, the scent of years, of secrets, of silence. A hand moves across the desk's surface, slow and deliberate, wiping away the dust that time left behind. The sound of cloth against wood echoes softly, the rhythm of memory brushing against the present. She doesn't speak. She doesn't need to. Her movements say enough, the care, the hesitation, the quiet sorrow that lingers in the way she pauses to look at every object before setting it aside. This is not just cleaning. This is communion. The kind that only happens when the person you loved is gone, and all that's left are the things they left behind. Sometimes, the things we don't say, find a way to speak, even after we're gone. Her name is Elena. 35. A woman of precision, the kind who folds grief neatly, tucks it away, and pretends it doesn't wrinkle. But today, the pretense falters. The study is her father's, or was. Every corner hums with the quiet echo of him, his books lined like sentinels, his notes scattered as though he might walk in any moment to finish a thought. She lingers on the typewriter, fingers grazing the cool metal keys. It's old, heavy, but solid. Like him. Like the man who never said much, but whose silence filled every room. There's a ritual in how she works. Sorting, stacking, pausing. A delicate rhythm of remembering. And then, a sound. A faint rattle. The drawer on the right doesn't open. She tries again. Nothing. She leans closer, squints at the small brass handle. It's locked. Her hand freezes, and something in her chest tightens. The light shifts across her face, catching the flicker of curiosity, and something else. Fear, maybe. Or longing. Her breath catches as she traces the drawer's edge. It's smooth from years of use, but the lock is still firm. She steps back, staring at it as if it's staring back. A part of her wants to leave it. Some doors, after all, are meant to stay closed. But another part, the one that's still a daughter, needs to know. She whispers under her breath, not sure who she's talking to. What were you hiding, Dad? Silence answers. The clock ticks once, twice, then stops. The whole room holds its breath. She bends down, peering underneath, and her eyes catch something unexpected, a piece of tape, brittle with age, clinging to the underside of the desk. And beneath it, a small, tarnished key. She reaches for it, fingers trembling just slightly. The moment stretches. Dust drifts through the light again, soft, slow, suspended, like the space between memory and truth. Her voice breaks the quiet, low, thoughtful. He never told me everything, but maybe he didn't have to. The piano begins, a soft, lingering note that carries the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. And as the screen fades to black, all that remains is the sound of the key turning gently in her hand, unlocking the past, one breath at a time. The house remembers her before she does. It knows the shape of her footsteps, the places she will pause, the shelves she will study as if reading the chapters of a life she thought she already knew. Elena moves through the rooms with the practiced care of someone cataloging relics, not for museums but for herself, each box a small biography, each photograph a proof that time still keeps its promises. She works methodically, folding shirts the way her father used to fold receipts, stacking papers with the same precise corners. There's an economy to her grief. She tills the present as if burying feelings neatly, as if order might stave off the ache. Her hands are steady, but her face is a map of things held in. She is mid-30s, deliberate in her silences, the kind of person who answers questions with actions and lets the gap speak for her. The house offers up 100 small images that stitch together a picture of him, a workbench smudged with sawdust, a mug with dried coffee at the bottom, a battered sweater folded over a chair. Old photographs, tucked into a shoebox, lift the veil on a quieter history. She opens one and the past spills in, a younger man with broad shoulders, laughing at something off-frame, a smaller version of her, cheeks full with gum and sunlight, a scraped knee bandaged tight, him at the edge of a graduation ceremony, hands folded, eyes fixed on her like a lighthouse. They are moments of gentleness held at arm's length, tenderness expressed in actions rather than declarations. Dad wasn't the kind of man who said, "I love you." He built shelves instead. Fixed the roof. That was his language, the voice in her head murmurs, a line she's spoken to herself more than once, and in it there is neither accusation nor absolution, only recognition. She remembers him tightening a bike chain while her legs swung against the frame, his face concentrated, hands sure. She remembers him sitting across from her at the dinner table, the television low and his eyes on the newspaper. He would listen more than he spoke, and when he did say something it landed and stayed. The flashbacks come soft, like the way dust motes move through slanted light, accidental and inevitable. They stitch together the small architecture of a life, the way he would repair rather than explain, the way he measured his care in labor and late nights. She is, in a way, shaped by that silence, taught to measure love in deeds rather than words. And then the study opens up like the inside of a head. Shelves of books rise and lean with the weight of ideas, neat rolls of blueprints, edges curling like patient waves, a typewriter, keys yellowed with use, sits like an island of patience. There are unfinished letters pinned with the gentleness of a man who could not bring himself to post what he had already put on paper. The camera of her memory, that sharp, private lens, lingers on a framed letter propped against a stack of journals. The envelope is unaddressed, the handwriting neat and intimate, the paper yellowed at the edges. There's a hush in the room, a sense that these objects hold conversations left incomplete. She moves from desk to chair, fingers brushing the spines of books with the familiarity of someone returning to a conversation paused years ago. She imagines him here, late at night, the lamp a small sun, writing words he never spoke aloud because maybe he feared the sound of his own voice. He was, she thinks, a writer to himself if not to anyone else, someone who used ink to translate what his face could not. The thought both consoles and unsettles her, the idea that the man who repaired the world with his hands might have been building a private language in secret. The inciting moment arrives as something quiet and ordinary, a drawer that will not open. She approaches it out of habit, a kind of domestic pilgrimage, not expecting anything to be different. The right-hand drawer resists her. She tries the keys in the ring that hangs from the drawer beneath the typewriter, none fit. She jiggles, she presses, she tugs. Frustration, small and sharp, gathers like static. The wood is warm from years of touch, the brass handle worn to a soft sheen, and still the lock holds. Elena pauses and studies it the way one studies an old friend's expression for a sign of change. The locked drawer becomes a question in the room, an uneven note that refuses to resolve. She breathes in and out, the rhythm of the house and of her breath aligning. As she leans down to peer under the desk, something catches the corner of her eye, a strip of tape, brittle with age, clinging stubbornly to the underside like a secret hung out of sight. Fingers hover. Her hand reaches, hesitant at first, then with the growing surety of someone who has made up her mind. She peels the tape away, it gives a brittle little sigh. Beneath it lies a small brass key, tarnished and warm with its own private history. Her fingers close around it and for a moment the world narrows to the small weight in her palm and the muted possibility it represents. It's funny how curiosity can sound like grief whispering your name, she thinks, almost amused at the way longing and mourning mingle until they are indistinguishable. She brings the key to the lock, the metal clicking into place with a sound that is small and monumental at once. The drawer resists a breath, then gives, sliding open with a long, complaining creak that echoes through the study like a released held note. Inside, arranged with a careful hand, is a stack of envelopes, each one yellowed at the edges, each one addressed in the same steady script, for Elena, age 7, for Elena, age 8, for Elena, age 9. The sight of them arrests her, the years laid out in neat progression like stepping stones across a river she hadn't realized she still needed to cross. Her throat tightens. The envelopes lie silent, but they are louder than anything else in the room. They are promises kept past the point of keeping. She sits back on her heels, the weight of the moment settling into her like a new gravity. The camera pulls in close on the stack, on the inked years, on the way the letters seem to hum with the small electric charge of the life they contain. For a beat, for the length of a breath stretched thin, everything is held. Then, cut to black. The envelopes are heavier than she expects, as if each holds not just paper but the small gravity of a life lived in fragments. Elena lifts the first one with fingers that remember a child's eagerness, the way she used to tear open birthday cards, the way the world once fit neatly into a ribbon. The handwriting is his, the same steady, slightly slanted script that has been a map across the desk for years. She slides out the page, unfolds it as if opening a small present, and the room seems to hush around her. The letter begins simply, like a man testing how to speak after a long silence. For Elena, age 7, it reads. The lines are spare but warm. He tells her, plainly, that he missed that birthday. He was working 2 jobs to keep the roof from leaking, to buy the things that made life feel like it had a future. He describes the bicycle he bought for her, how he stood in the rain, thinking about the bright red paint and the way the chain clicked. He admits, in a sentence that is both apology and confession, that he felt guilty for missing the cake, for not being there to blow out the candles with her. There is a pride threaded through the words, small and stubborn. I watched you learn to pedal, I was proud of how brave you were, even when I was not brave enough to be present. The letter folds around these things like a hand folded around a small bird. A voice, imagined, remembered, conjured, breathes the words back to her, his cadence soft, patient. I wish I'd been there. But maybe someday, when you read this, you'll know, I was never far away. The overlap of his voice with her reading turns the paper into a bridge. For a moment she is 7 again, knee-skinned, cheeks sticky with cake, and the man who fixed the fence is telling her, in ink, that he saw her. Tears prick behind her eyes, they are the kind that arrive quietly, with the surprise of rain after drought. She laughs in the hollow of her throat, a laugh that is also a sob, because the image he paints is both ridiculous and perfect, him, standing in the rain over a bicycle, imagining her joy. She allows herself to be small in that memory, to be loved in the way he knew how to love. She reads through the stack like this, each envelope a year folded into a neat apology or a story. Age 8, a tale about a scraped knee he still keeps tucked in his wallet in the form of a hospital band. Age 9, a story about an attic radio that played a song which reminded him of her, and how he hummed it into the darkness so it would follow him home. With each letter, the past rearranges itself, small, missed moments shift into meaning. Her reactions are messy and immediate, she alternates between smiling at the intimacy of some memory and flinching at the silence of another. The letters are a mosaic of tenderness and avoidance, the way a man might build a house sturdy enough to shelter but forget to paint the door. And then she comes to a gap. There is no envelope for 13. The stack flips past 12 into 14, and in that absence Elena feels the missing year like a physical absence on the desk, a space pressed into the wood. She remembers 13 with the clarity of a wound. It was the year they argued until the air between them was thin as glass. She remembers the slam of a door, the feeling of footsteps on the road as she walked away, and the 2 days she spent sleeping under a neighbor's porch, angry and raw and feeling both small and enormous at once. She remembers the voicemail on her little flip phone, his voice, quiet and panicked, leaving a message she never listened to until years later. The wound reopened as she reads. The gap in the letters is an accusation that takes the shape of a question. Why not 13? Sometimes, silence becomes its own apology, her inner voice says, and it tastes both true and bitter. The thought settles like dust. She thinks of all the ways silence has been used in their household, as shield, as punishment, as a way of preserving dignity. But silence can also be a way of avoiding the trouble of words. But some wounds stay quiet too long, she adds, hearing the outline of a truth that had previously been too sharp to touch. The absence of a letter is not simply a missing page, it is a decision, perhaps, to leave a wound unaddressed. She runs her thumb along the envelope for 14 as if it could reveal what 13 refused to say. The moral crossroads reveals itself not as a thunderclap but as a series of small bends in the road. Each letter asks her to choose, to continue unspooling a man's private archive of love and regret, or to close the drawer and keep the past at a manageable distance. To read is to reopen, to not read is to shelter herself from further unraveling. She feels the tug. There are practical reasons to stop. Grief is heavy, and grief in long stretches can be corrosive. There are emotional ones. Why give him more power to unsettle her when he is no longer here to take responsibility for the consequences? There is also a quieter, more complicated pull, to finish what he started, to understand the silence he left behind. She realizes that each letter is not merely about remembering him but about answering questions she was never brave enough to ask. The room seems to hold its breath as she decides. The weight in her chest feels like an old photograph pressed under a stack of bills, necessary to keep, but heavy when lifted. Elena places the next envelope on her lap. Reading, she knows, will require her to be both child and adult, to receive the apologies meant for a younger self and to interpret them with the wisdom of the woman she has become. She understands the precariousness of the choice. There is no guidebook for parsing posthumous explanations. Yet another voice, softer, steadier, nudges her forward. You'll never get to ask him, but you can listen, it seems to say. She breathes and lets the paper open her like a door she has avoided for years. As she reads on, the letters begin to reveal a pattern, not a defense but a confession, not a systematic accounting but an honest ledger of small failures and fierce love. He speaks of being afraid to show weakness, of learning to express care through fixing a leaky pipe rather than through conversation. He confesses to fearing that his words would change her image of him, that some truths might make the foundation they had together crack. Each confession lands like a stone in water, ripples catching in her memory and changing its contours. She feels grief and anger and tenderness move through her in waves that do not cancel each other out but coexist, layered and complex. Music swells in the edges of the room, a piano note here, a cello line there, and the soundtrack of her life thickens. Grief and love weave together, not as enemies but as braided strands of the same thing. Elena keeps reading. The act of reading becomes an act of choosing life, to hold the complicated truth of a man who loved imperfectly and to let that imperfect love inform how she moves forward. With every sentence she reads, she stitches a new seam between past and present, a seam that will not erase the hurt but might, in time, hold it with grace. The crescendo is subtle, not cinematic in a Hollywood way, but true. She decides to continue, to let the letters be her conversation with a father who could not speak what he had written. The moral crossroads does not resolve in a tidy answer, it becomes instead a direction, a way of carrying what she has learned into whatever comes next. The page trembles in her hands, and she turns it, inhaling the fragile, stubborn scent of paper and memory. There is a particular silence that follows discovery, a taut, expectant hush, like the moment after you lift the lid of a box and the air releases a smell you didn't know you missed. Elena sits on the floor by the desk, the stack of envelopes in her lap like a small, private liturgy. The room folds around her, the light from the window is patient and indifferent, laying itself across the pages as if trying to read along. As she moves deeper into the stack, the handwriting shifts. At first it is the steady, confident script of a man who has practiced making sentences into small, reliable structures. But somewhere in the middle of the pile the ink grows paler, the letters slant differently, the curves less sure. It reads like the map of a retreat, each loop of the pen a footprint that grew lighter as the writer walked on. The change is small at first, a shaky line here, a hesitant comma there, but it accumulates until the letters themselves become evidence. The sentences begin to tremble with the urgency of a man who realizes the time left to shape memory is shrinking. The pages move from storytelling, anecdotes about rain-soaked bicycles, attic radios, hospital bands kept in wallets, to something narrower and more urgent, confession. He writes of nights he could not sleep, of a chest tight with words that would not leave his mouth, of the particular loneliness of a man who believed his role was to hold up the house and not necessarily the people within it. The voice on the page sounds smaller, closer, as if he is reading the words into the pillow at his side. She reads one after another and notices how frequently he repeats phrases about not wanting to burden or frighten her. The letters become a sort of map of the unspoken, the fears he kept folded like laundry, the compromises he made, the small heroics of his everyday labor that were, simultaneously, his love notes. And then the confessions arrive more plainly, admissions of regret, of having missed more than cake and candles, of the ways his silence had sometimes been a refuge rather than a strength. In one passage, written with an earnestness that strips away any remaining reserve, he says, "I started writing because I couldn't talk. I kept writing because I was scared you'd forget me." The line is simple, almost painfully direct, and it lands like a hand on the back of her neck, steadying and shaking all at once. When Elena reads it, she feels both seen and unmoored. The realization unfurls inside her: those envelopes were not merely apology or an exercise in posthumous caretaking. They were a deliberate architecture, a scaffolding he built around the possibility of his absence. For years he had been constructing, in ink, a presence that would replace his physical one. It reframes the old narrative. His distance, which she had once catalogued as aloofness, might have been something else entirely: preparation. He had been speaking in pages because he believed himself incapable of speaking aloud, and in that private logic the letters were a means to teach her how to proceed in a life that might not contain him. But the revelation does not tidy itself into comfort. Instead, it branches into new questions that feel at once intimate and unanswerable. If he wrote to prepare her, did that mean he was accepting defeat long before the disease, or whatever secret illness it was, finished its work? Did he think telling her the truth sooner would have destroyed her capacity to live? The letters become a calculus of protection and omission, and Elena finds herself parsing motives with the meticulousness of someone who has always measured love by utility. Each paragraph she reads now is a negotiation between gratitude and resentment. She keeps turning pages. In one envelope her fingers find a photograph folded like a pressed leaf. The image is small and candid, her father in a hospital gown, thin in a way that the photographs tucked among the family albums never were. The edges of the photo are curled and faintly stained from some past dampness. He smiles in the picture, but it is a brave, small smile, the kind one offers at a public exhibition rather than at home. There is a tube near his arm, a date stamped on the corner that places this moment years earlier than any of them had realized. The camera in the photograph has captured both the softness of his attempt at normalcy and a truth he could not disguise. Elena holds the photo and the room seems to tilt. The realization hits slow and then all at once. He had known. He had been keeping time with a clock she had not seen. The letters after the image take on a new cast. They are written with a clarity of purpose that chills her, not the shaky loops that betrayed exhaustion, but sentences that read like a person attending to each detail of an inheritance that is not financial but emotional. He writes about the small things he is leaving her: the bicycle story as a memory she should keep when she learns to forgive herself, the attic radio as a metaphor for listening when the world hums too loudly to hear the truth, the hospital band kept in his wallet as proof of something he both feared and accepted. The last few letters, the ones closest to the photo, are not attempts at repair so much as instructions, each sentence a careful stitch in a garment he hoped would fit her life after he was gone. And yet the admission of his foreknowledge throws Elena into a new kind of disarray. Images and memories she had never connected now cohere into a timeline she had been too young or too willful to notice. Sudden bathroom slips of memory, afternoons when he would vanish for hours and return with small parcels and averted eyes, these moments acquire weight. He had been cataloging farewell in secret, and the knowledge that he had been writing to a future she could not yet predict feels at once generous and imposing. There is a kindness in the act of preparing, but there is also the disquiet of being the subject of a plan made without your consent. She thinks of the way he lingered in doorways, the way he would look at her at graduation with a distance she had once mistaken for stoicism. She thinks now that perhaps he had been practicing a posture for all of their tomorrows, a way of standing that wouldn't collapse. That thought brings a tenderness into her throat and a question that is sharper than tenderness can soothe. If his distance had been preparation, then why did he not tell her? Why did he not say, in a voice that might have been heard and argued with and hardened or softened, "I am sick," or "I might not be here," or "Please let me show you how to be without me"? Instead he had chosen the quiet architecture of letters, a private conversation that she would only find in the aftermath. Was that protection, or was it an abdication of the messy labor of honest relationship? Her hands tremble as she reads the lines where he imagines her older, imagined the ways she might need guidance. "By the time you read this, I'll have missed too much," one letter says in his voice that she can hear on the page, the cadence of regret ringing clear. "But I hope these words reach you like sunlight through the dust." The simile is awkward in its earnestness, but the image it evokes sits with her. She can picture dust motes suspended in a beam of morning light, each one making visible the otherwise invisible. He hoped his words would be enough to illuminate a road he could no longer walk with her. The tenderness in that hope begins to settle into her bones. There is grief in recognizing the depth of his care even as anger simmers in the small spaces between. She moves back and forth through the letters as one who combs through a body for signs of life, not to resuscitate but to understand what is left. There are confessions that read like casual observations, the times he lied about being late because he was embarrassingly scared, the nights he sat awake worrying whether he had taught her to be kind, the memories of holding a crying child in the dark and feeling both helpless and enormous. There are also notes of humility, an admission that he had been afraid that telling her would change her image of him, that perhaps some truths are better rendered in ink than in a voice he feared would be brittle. He writes, too, of small joys, the color of her handwriting when she was small, the way she used to hum tunelessly as she braided hair, the sound of her laughter when she got something right. As the letters accumulate, Elena experiences a strange version of intimacy, not the incandescent kind that arrives with confessed love, but something slower and more durable, the intimacy of attention. He had paid attention to details she had long forgotten, the scar behind her knee from falling off a swing, the way she liked the crust of warm bread, the fact that she always watered plants on Saturday mornings. These small attentions are not grand gestures, but they're some forms a portrait of caregiving that is hard to deny. She feels at once grateful and ineffectual, grateful for the labor he performed in the dark and ineffectual because she cannot answer him now, cannot tell him how his absence rewrites the grammar of her days. The revelation spirals into a new emotional question that refuses simple answers. Was his silence protection, a way of sparing her a knowledge that might have made the years they had together heavier and smaller? Or was his silence a kind of punishment, an avoidance of the work of conversation that would have allowed for anger and reconciliation and messy love? The letters, astonishing in their tenderness and partial in their truth, do not absolve him. They do not offer a clean moral ledger where virtues and failures are tallied and balanced. Instead they amplify the complexity of human choices, how love and fear, courage and cowardice, can exist in the same hand that sets script into paper. Elena finds herself speaking aloud despite the emptiness of the house, not because anyone answers but because she needs to send sound into the world as if it could travel back. "Why didn't you tell me, Dad?" The question is simple and absolute, a child's demand dressed in adult grammar. The voice that answers is not his, it is the room returning her query, the echo of her own grief. She imagines his face, the map of lines around his mouth when he tried to smile, the way his eyes would avoid directness to keep from spilling the things he could not name. She can almost hear him confessing a reason, fear that telling would make her too young to learn how to live without him, or a conviction that quietly building a guidebook was the only way he could be in two places at once. She turns the photograph over in her hand, feeling the tiny ridge where the date was stamped, and the weight of what he had done settles into something like comprehension. He had chosen to be both present and absent, to leave her an archive rather than a conversation. The choice seems less selfish when seen as a man trying to distribute care across a future he could not alter. Still, comprehension does not equal forgiveness. The knowledge that he wrote because he could not speak does not erase the ache of the silence he imposed. Instead, it complicates the ache, filling it with colors of intention and fear and a very human striving toward what he could not attain. In the long hush that follows reading, Elena sets the photograph down and rests her head against the desk. The wood is warm from the afternoon light, and she feels for a moment that she is braced between what he did and what he did not do. She lets out a breath that is both a surrender and a decision. Part of her wants to close the letters and put them back where she found them, to allow the past to remain neatly contained. But another part, the part that has always been stubbornly honest, wants to keep reading, to keep collecting the evidence of a man who loved awkwardly but truly. She whispers again, this time softer, an almost prayer to a man who can no longer answer, "Why didn't you tell me, Dad?" The question hangs there, a small, fragile thing, and in the silence that follows she imagines the inked reply he would have given if time had allowed: apologies, 1,000 small practicalities, perhaps a clumsy attempt at explanation. But the only answer is the stack of envelopes, the photograph, the diminished script that tells a story at once painful and tender. The revelation has rearranged her memory, she now sees the architecture of his care. Whether that care redeems the silence is a question that will live with her, an open wound and a healed place in the same breath. She breathes in, tasting the dust and paper and the faint perfume of cedar, and lets the next letter fall open in her hands. There is a peculiar stillness that settles over a house at the edge of decision, not empty, exactly, but attentive, like a room listening for a single note to finish its phrase. Elena has read so many of his sentences that the air around the desk feels saturated with his voice. It is as if the room itself could speak his rhythms. And yet, despite the intimacy of the pages, despite the way his handwriting has become a map across her palms, only one envelope remains. It sits at the bottom of the drawer like a final island, its edges the color of a late afternoon. She stares at it for a long time, noticing the small details, the way the light catches on the inked name, the slight fray at one corner, the way the paper lifts faintly when her breath meets it. There is an odd reluctance to open it, a fear that the letter might be both the culmination of everything she has been seeking and the thing that will unmake her. She turns the envelope over in her hands, feeling the thin swell where a seal once held steady. The house hums with ordinary noises, the neighbor's radio from 2 houses away, a lawnmower distant and futile, the pipes somewhere in the walls making their small complaints. All of it seems banal and sacred at once. She slides a finger beneath the flap and pulls. The paper resists, then gives, a small sound like a bird startled from a windowsill. Inside is a single sheet, creased neatly, the ink the same steady hand has used across years. Her eyes skim it first, then slow as if the speed of reading might betray a lack of reverence. She breathes and reads aloud, not because anyone else is there to hear but because the voice makes the words live. I always knew you'd find this when you were ready. I'm proud of the woman you've become. Some goodbyes are planned in silence, and spoken only by time. The line is so deceptively simple that at first it seems like an offering, a ribbon tied finally around all the other pages. The phrase, planned in silence, shivers through her like wind through bare branches. She reads it again, sinking into the cadence of the sentence, feeling how it compresses years into a few tender syllables. In that moment, the letter is not simply a farewell, it is a small philosophy. There is a recognition that some endings cannot be negotiated, only designed, and that design can be a way of loving as much as it can be a way of opting out. The shock of this recognition is not violent, it comes like the lowering of a tide that reveals a shore she has always walked without seeing. She sits back on her heels with the page trembling in her hands. Tears come first as an almost compulsory response, a physical chemistry of grief and relief, but then more complex things follow, a swell of anger that tastes like iron, a dull ache of disappointment, and under it all a fragile thread of gratitude. The words, "I'm proud of the woman you've become," are like a warm mitten placed over a cold palm. They are ordinary words and yet they are rare, spoken now when the man who could have said them most often is gone. The sentence carries a weight that is equal parts balm and accusation, balm because it affirms her, accusation because he had been silent when she might have needed that affirmation alive. She rereads the line about goodbyes planned in silence and thinks about all the choices he must have made to make that plan possible. She imagines him in this house, late at night, lamp on low, paper before him, folding one year into the next not as a duty but as a structure of care. He had been constructing her future in sentences, preparing her for absence as if absence were a weather pattern she could learn to forecast. The thought is both generous and lonely. It tells her that he loved her in the only ways he felt he knew how, but it also shows that he did not believe she could be part of the planning. The paradox sits heavy and lovely and painful in her chest. Her hands shake as she puts the letter down. The room seems to contract as if the paper has absorbed the entire atmosphere and redistributed it in a denser form. For a long while she does not move. Memory is a cut stone, it only yields to pressure. She remembers the small, ordinary gestures that had always been the grammar of their relationship, him showing up with a repaired hinge, him standing at the back of the room at family dinners like a sentinel of quiet. She remembers the nights when she thought his silence was a judgment and not, perhaps, a kind of armor. She remembers the times she wanted him to be brash and loud and instead found in him a quieter creed. The final letter reframes these recollections as the deliberate acts of a man who had chosen to speak in a medium he could control. There is an urge to gather the letters, to take them outside and fling them to the wind as if the physical act could scatter grief as easily as paper. But she does something different. She folds the page again along its old creases and tucks it into the stack, fitting his farewell back into the chronology of his attempt at care. She collects the whole bundle like a relic, clutching it to her chest for a moment like a child with a prize. The house feels too small for what she is holding, it is a vertical thing she needs to carry into open air. Dawn is a fragile thing of its own making. Elena steps outside into the pre-dawn hush that feels like the world holding its breath before beginning to speak. The sky is a slow watercolor, inked blues and pale grays smeared by a hand that has not yet decided whether to light the day. The air is crisp, alive with the smell of damp soil and the metallic tang of impending rain. She walks barefoot across the dew-soft grass, letters pressed to her sternum, and each step is a small declaration, I will not hide this grief in the dark. The house recedes behind her, a silhouette of timber and memory, and the horizon opens like a secret. As she walks, she unfolds the first letter, then the next, letting the pages breathe in the open air. They are private and public at once, intimate lines exposed to the morning's impartial witness. She finds a place beneath an old maple tree, the kind that has witnessed seasons and held on, and sits down. There are no grand gestures, no cinematic decision waiting to be made with a trumpeted chord. Instead, she sits and lets the letters be what they are, hands extended across time. She reads little bits aloud, not because she needs to mark the occasion but because speaking the words once might make them less like relics and more like conversations. The sky blushes faintly as the sun prepares to rise, and with each sentence she reads, the world gains color. Then, quietly, without fanfare, the resolution that had been coiling inside her for days unspools. It is not a dramatic epiphany so much as a slow agreement between parts of herself that have been at odds. She feels, in that softened space, the years of anger and the years of tenderness holding hands. The ache that had tightened into a knot begins to relinquish its grip just a little. She allows herself to name what she has resisted, the need to forgive not because he asked for it, but because she needs to free herself from the shape of that anger. Forgiveness is not a gift for him, it is an act of economy for her life. The letters have shown her the contours of his limitations, the sincerity of his attempts. They have also shown her the private ways he tried to be present, and that knowledge changes the algebra of her grief. Elena breathes in the early light and whispers, in a voice that is not performative but real, I forgive you. The words are small and almost apologetic in their timidity, but they are also enormous. They spread through her chest like a slow tide washing away the sharpest flints. The act of forgiving is not instantaneous peace, it is a loosening, a small unclasping. As she says the words, rawness and relief coexist in a complicated truce. Tears come, not from an unprocessed wound, but from the relief of allowing grief to be both ache and blessing at once. The wind rises as if in response, a soft, obliging current that stirs the leaves above and lifts the edges of the letters in her lap. For a moment, and in a way that feels like a small miracle rather than a manufactured moment, the pages flutter. Sunlight, hesitant at first, breaks through a thinning band of cloud and touches the paper. The effect is modest and absolute. The sunlight makes the ink glow a little brighter, the wind sets the letters in motion, scattering a few pages into a gentle choreography. She watches them lift and fold and trace small arcs in the air, and the sensation is both devastating and consoling. It is as if the physical act of letting the pages go into the wind is a way of letting words move beyond the hold of the house and into the world. Music, not a soundtrack in the literal sense but the music of small natural things, accompanies this. The rustle of leaves, the low call of a distant bird, the thud of a neighbor's bin being rolled out for the morning, these sounds gather into a weird orchestration. The orchestral build the life of a big cinematic moment promises is there in spirit, swells of feeling, crescendos of acceptance. Yet it is quieter than any commercial drama, purer. It is the kind of crescendo that happens in people, not in script supervisors' plans, an interior score of reconciliation played out in the small theater of a backyard at dawn. She stands when a breeze picks up and scatters a few more pages. For a moment she lets them go, watching them catch sunlight and then trail off, like small birds finding direction. The sight is not cathartic in a tidy way, she does not feel all healed, nor does she expect to. Forgiveness here is a beginning, not a conclusion. It does not erase what was done or left undone, it simply changes how she carries it. The letters, many of them still in her hands, are now less a heaving chest of accusation and more a toolkit, items she can draw on when the house feels too loud, when the nights are too long, when she needs to hear a voice from the past to steady her. She tucks the remaining envelopes back into their stack and, finally, returns them to the drawer. This is not a burial, it is a placement. She does it carefully, as if ensuring that the architecture he built remains intact but accessible. The drawer closes with a soft, final sound, not a slam but a settled click, the sound of something returning to its planned place. She folds her hands over the wood for a second, feeling its warmth, feeling the continuity of what men and women have always done, leave traces of themselves that someone else will find. As the sky brightens and the day takes its proper shape, Elena walks back toward the house. Each step is steady now, not because the ache is gone but because it has found its purpose. The letters will live somewhere between memory and instruction, proof of a love that was complicated and sincere. Forgiveness, she knows, will have to be practiced, it will reappear in decisions small and large. But the simple act of saying it aloud, and the humble ceremony of letting the pages touch the wind, has altered her. In the quiet that follows, the world is not whole, nothing mends that quickly, but there is a new room in her chest where grief and gratitude can coexist without tearing one another apart. The orchestral swell quiets into a single, steady note, and she steps back inside, letters in their place, sunrise behind her, carrying the parallel truths of love and imperfection like a light she has learned to navigate by. A year settles like a soft coat over the house, and with the passing of that time the sharp edges of the mornings after his death begin to dull. Grief does not leave so much as rearrange the furniture of a life, it becomes a room you move through with greater ease, sometimes without thinking, sometimes with ritual. Elena moves through that new room like someone who has learned new steps, habitual, careful, but no longer stopped at every doorway. The letters live with her now not as a wound that throbs but as a kind of architecture, a set of rooms she can enter when she needs to, leave when she must. She has taken the final act of that private archive and folded it into the shape of her days. In the year since the drawer opened, Elena has reshaped a part of herself around what she learned there. She teaches writing now, not as an occupation she picked casually but as a vocation that feels like an extension of what the letters taught her, that the small acts of attention, the patient arrangement of words, can hold as much care as any physical repair. Her classroom is modest, a room in a community art center with a chalkboard that keeps its ghosts of old lessons, a battered desk that could have been plucked from her father's study, and windows that face a street where the light shifts and tells different stories across the day. Her students are an eclectic anthology of the city, a nurse who writes when the house finally sleeps, a retired mechanic who poems himself awake at dawn, a teenager with ink-stained fingers who keeps paper under his mattress. They come with different intentions, some to be published, some to be heard, some simply to learn the quietness of making a sentence hold truth. Elena begins each class with a ritual she lifted from the way her father wrote. She asks them to bring something that feels heavy, a memory, a regret, a joy, and to let the object teach them. Sometimes it's a photograph passed from hand to hand, sometimes a song played low through the room, sometimes simply the memory of something that happened when no one else was watching. She reads a line from one of the letters now and then, never the whole series, never the most intimate confessions, but enough to give permission, that words can be both a shelter and a tool, that they can be written for someone else and still belong to the writer. The students respond to that permission with a hunger that surprises her. Some cry in the corners of the room because the act of shaping a sentence becomes a way to hold a feeling without being crushed by it. She keeps the letters in a wooden box, simple, unvarnished, the kind of box that seems to know how to hold things without needing to be noticed. The key that opened the drawer sits on a cord around her neck most days, a small metallic heart that rests against her sternum like a talisman. Sometimes she forgets it's there until she brushes a hand to her throat and feels the cool weight of brass. The gesture of wearing it is both private and performative, private because it steadies her in ways she cannot easily explain, performative because, on certain afternoons, a student will notice and ask, and she will tell them the barest outline of a story, no names, no confessions, just the truth that sometimes people leave preparations for those they love. The key is a physical mnemonic of the fact that memory can be unlocked and put back, and that what we inherit is not always money or property but strategies for continuing. Her students begin an exercise called Letters They'll Never Send. At first it is a prompt, 20 minutes of free writing, an invitation to write to someone they will never give this to. The parameters are deliberately loose. The letter can be angry, tender, absurd, full of instruction, full of confession. The classroom becomes a small laboratory of honesty, and she walks among the desks like a nurse in a ward for fragile thoughts. She reads some of the pieces aloud, anonymously, with consent, and watches as the air around them changes. There is something gentle and subversive about the exercise. It allows a space to speak what the living world might not safely receive, to practice tenderness in the safe economy of paper. Students who have hoarded emotions for years discover they can make them into sentences. Those sentences, once articulated, do not always demand resolution. They create instead a companion for the days when the original person is distant, absent, or indifferent. Elena watches this process with a kind of reverence that still surprises her. She remembers how, a year before, the letters in the drawer had demanded that she measure and remeasure the balance between loving someone and expecting from them speech they could not give. Teaching becomes part of her own continuation, an act that carries forward what she learned without reducing it to prescriptive advice. She does not tell her students to forgive or to forget. She asks them to listen to the texture of their sentences and to notice where their hearts tighten. Sometimes she assigns the explanation of a seemingly mundane object, because small details, she has come to believe, contain compound truths. Once a week she places a photograph on the table and asks, what would this person have needed to hear? They write awkwardly at first, then with a kind of growing confidence, as if practicing a muscle. Outside the classroom, Elena builds rituals. She drinks the same tea reserved now for mornings when she plans to read. She tends a small basil plant on the windowsill and says its name aloud on bad days so that it will, at least, be known. She has started writing letters of another sort, draft letters to herself that she tucks into the wooden box when she needs perspective. They are drafts of courage, sentences that tell her what to do when grief returns like a tide after storms. Sometimes she opens the box at night and reads one like a prayer. The letters her father wrote are not sacrosanct relics she never touches, they are working tools, and she uses them to train new ways of being. She argues, privately, with his choices and then with compassion, because that is what he would have wanted, honesty folded under a coat of quiet care. A year has taught her that there is no single way to grieve, no single moral ledger where you can tally sins and virtues until they balance. There are only continuations, small commitments you make to the people left behind and to your own life. One of the students, a woman who has the habit of laughing when she is nervous, writes a letter in class to a sister she had stopped visiting. The letter is raw, stumbling, and full of mundane apologies. The student reads it aloud and the room listens like a congregation. Afterwards, she texts her sister, the sister replies with a single line, "We'll get coffee next week." It is not monumental, but it is enough. Elena keeps that moment tucked somewhere like a dried flower. It is evidence that sentences can make openings in the world that courage alone sometimes cannot. In quieter hours, Elena returns to the question that had lodged in her chest the year before: was his silence protection or punishment? The letters do not resolve it. They complicate it. She has come to hold both possibilities at once, like two hands cupping a fragile bird. Some of his choices read as protective, the way a parent might hide the hard truth of an illness to keep a child from carrying guilt. Some read as avoidance, an abdication of the messy, human work of relationship where honesty is the only tool for repair. She has conversations about this inside herself, not with the intent to decide but with the intent to live with the complexity. She has learned to say the truth of both, aloud and without flinching. He loved me, and he failed me in ways that mattered, he protected me, and he kept me from sharing the plan of our lives. Saying both truths reduces nothing, it simply enlarges what she can hold. There are afternoons when the box sits closed and the key rests over her heart and she does not think about the letters at all. Those are not betrayals of memory but rather evidence of living. She goes to class, grades papers, drinks tea with the basil plant, and sometimes, in the middle of teaching, a line from one of his letters pops into her head and she smiles for no reason. There are also nights when she unwraps an envelope and reads the old sentences aloud, letting them serve as a lantern through the dark. On those nights, the pages are not relics of an absence but companions in a room she has learned to inhabit without needing everything explained. The lingering question, the one she will likely carry until she dies or until memory blunts it again, remains soft-edged rather than jagged. It is not a question she expects to have answered by anything external. It sits more like a prompt now, one she occasionally hands to her students as an exercise. If you had one last letter to write, what would it say? They write with earnest violence, sometimes with humor, sometimes with a kind of fearful tenderness. The answers vary, but patterns emerge: requests for forgiveness, lists of small things not to forget, instructions for how to water plants, confessions of love, offers of practical advice. The letters her students produce are not less meaningful because they are unsent. They are, in fact, intensely useful. They teach the authors how to speak expansively enough to include their own weaknesses. Elena sees the arc in that. The act of writing a letter you will never send is often an act of learning how to be honest with yourself. On an evening near the anniversary of the day she found the drawer, the class organizes a small reading in the community center. The room is full of faces she has come to recognize, some are new, some are old, and each carries a light of curiosity. She reads a short passage from one of the letters, no names, just a fragment that speaks about a bicycle in the rain, and then invites anyone who wants to share. The readings are careful and raw and sometimes hilarious in ways that make grief less solemn and more human. Afterwards, people linger and speak of their own versions of locked drawers and the keys they have found. The conversation moves in circles like smoke. Some find anger, some find release, some find a plan. They leave with the small consolation of not being alone in their contradictions. At the end of the evening, Elena stands alone for a moment in the darkened hall and listens to the echo of footsteps. She reaches up and touches the key at her throat, feeling its familiar coolness. She thinks of the man who had built his own architecture of care and of the student who had cried when reading about a sister they had not seen in years. She thinks about the ways people try to manage the future for those they love, sometimes lovingly, sometimes clumsily. She thinks of the line she once mouthed in the quiet of the study, the one that had shifted her life slightly: "We spend our lives trying to say the right words. But sometimes, love is written in silence." It is not a claim she offers as platitude but rather as study, a recognition that human love is as much about what we do not say as about what we do say. There remain things unsaid. There will always be things unsaid. She does not try to catalog them all. She keeps some as mysteries, as gentle wounds that remind her she is both human and whole. Near the window of her classroom, when the rain comes, she sits and writes letters she does not intend to mail, drafts of courage she sometimes tucks into the wooden box with the others. She writes to her father sometimes, not to instruct or to forgive but to practice language for the days ahead when other absences arrive. She knows now that goodbyes can be planned and that even planned goodbyes leave space for surprise. She knows that forgiveness is a muscle she will exercise unevenly and that love can be both shelter and source of bewilderment. Once, in a soft close-up conversation, one of those teaching moments made small and intimate, she looks directly into a student's eyes and asks, gently, the question that shaped her year: "What would you say if you had one last letter to write?" The student falters, then writes, then reads, then goes out into the world to do what the letter asked of them. Elena watches, and in watching she learns that the act of asking the question is itself an answer. It sends people toward the work of saying what matters. Perhaps that is the thing she will carry most faithfully from her father's letters, not the content of his confessions, but the method, how he used sentences to teach presence in absence. The camera would linger, if there were a camera, on her face then, a small, quiet smile, a look that contains both the knowledge of loss and the steadying practice of life. The music would thin to a single piano note, rain tapping softly at the glass, and the final line would come not as command but as invitation. What would you say, if you had one last letter to write? It is a question that does not demand a tidy answer, only an honest one. She tucks the key under her collar, folds her hands, and lets the rain provide its gentle percussion. Then she returns to the room, to the students waiting, to the ordinary insistence of a life that keeps going, more complicated, more generous, and, in the small ways that matter, more awake. Fade to piano and rain.